Greetings and welcome to this brief introduction to Plato's dialogue, the Parmenides. The Parmenides is sometimes called Plato's most difficult dialogue, and yet it's the only dialogue in which Plato depicts Socrates as very young, so young that Parmenides says that philosophy has not yet taken complete hold of him. Now, why would Plato present such difficult material to a young Socrates who's not even yet a philosopher? This is just one of the many puzzles of the Parmenides. The dialogue itself falls into three main parts. The first part is the narrative frame, and it's very strange. We learn that this conversation among Socrates, Zeno, Parmenides, and a young man named Aristotle took place many years ago. It has come down to the current speaker via a chain of transmission that involves three separate steps. Now, if you've read this dialogue, just imagine trying to memorize the entire thing. The only other dialogue that includes such a complex narrative frame is the Symposium, which is composed mainly of speeches in praise of eros, that is, passionate love. The second part of the dialogue is the conversation among Socrates, Zeno, and Parmenides. Parmenides was a philosopher from Italy who is famous for denying the reality of motion or change, and instead arguing that being is one, unmoving and eternal. He was an old man at the time of this conversation with young Socrates. Zeno was Parmenides' beloved student, and he made many arguments showing that if you believe that motion exists, you run into all sorts of paradoxes. In this conversation, the very young Socrates articulates his opinion that forms exist and cause all the things that appear to be. For example, he posits a form of likeness itself, which makes like things like each other, but is separate from all the things that are like. Or he posits a form of justice itself, which makes just things just, but is separate from all the just things. The teaching of the forms is, of course, something that Socrates became famous for later in his life. Here, however, Parmenides knocks the stuffing out of Socrates' forms. I won't go through all of Parmenides' arguments. I'll highlight only the last one, which Parmenides calls the greatest difficulty of all. If the forms are, he says, and are unchanging, then how can we human beings know them? God alone would know the forms. But then God would have no knowledge of us or mastery over our world, and we would have no contact with God. Socrates is completely befuddled. So here's another puzzle of the Parmenides. It takes what many people believe is Socrates' most distinctive teaching, the so-called theory of ideas or theory of forms, and it blows it to pieces, all while Socrates is very young. Now, in response to this beating, Parmenides says that Socrates shows promise, but that he needs to exercise himself in a certain gymnastic, which Parmenides calls a work-like game. Socrates asks Parmenides for an example of this verbal gymnastic. Parmenides tries to beg off, but the others join Socrates in his request, and so Parmenides accedes. He proposes using what he calls his own hypothesis, one is. He will show what follows for the one and for the things different than the one, both if one is and if one is not. This gymnastic occupies the third largest part of the dialogue, where Parmenides converses with young Aristotle. Now, before going on to this third part, let's notice another puzzle. The historical Parmenides was famous for saying that being was one and unmoving, etc. But saying being is one is different than saying one is. What is this one that Plato's Parmenides talks about? Is it God? Is it the good? Is Plato putting words into Parmenides' mouth? In the third part, Parmenides and Aristotle make 8 arguments. The first 4 start with the hypothesis, one is. The first 2 consider what follows for the one itself, if one is. The third and fourth consider what follows for the things different than the one, if the one is. The next 4 arguments start with the hypothesis, the one is not. The 5th and 6th arguments consider specifically what follows for the one itself, if the one is not. And the 7th and 8th consider what follow for the different things than the one, if the one is not. So you have 2 groups of 4 arguments and 4 pairs, and each member of these 4 pairs of arguments contradicts the other. So we get this conclusion in which Parmenides summarizes all 8 arguments. He says, "So it looks, whether one is or is not, both it and the different things, both in relation to themselves and in relation to each other, all in all ways, both are and are not, and both appear and do not appear." Young Aristotle replies, "Most true." Now, what are we to make of this third part, which some people have likened to word salad? Is Plato playing a joke on Parmenides? If so, it's perhaps the most tedious joke in all of history. But if it's not a joke, how does this gymnastic exercise help young Socrates overcome what look like insuperable objections to his forms? Here we find perhaps the greatest puzzle of the Parmenides. The subject matter seems to concern the greatest things: being, the forms, the one, God, but the manner of discussing these subjects seems absurd. Now, if there's one thing we know about Plato, it's that he had complete control over his writing. If he wrote the Parmenides this way, it was for a reason. I can't solve all these puzzles for you. Maybe the most helpful thing a teacher can do is to point them out to his students and to himself. I would add only this suggestion. The Parmenides is full of opposites. Old Parmenides, young Socrates, seriousness, play, work, games, like versus unlike, same versus other, motion versus rest, one versus many, is versus is not. The list could go on. Now, what does it mean for philosophy to take hold of someone? Perhaps what it means is refusing to separate these opposites, refusing to talk only of forms of likeness or justice, but dismissing hair and mud, refusing to idolize the one and scorn the many, recognizing instead that philosophy lives in the space between knowledge and ignorance, namely opinion, recognizing that our opinions, while partial, for that very reason disclose something of a whole. This recognition is what Socrates himself will come to call eros. Thank you for joining this brief introduction to Plato's dialogue, the Parmenides.